The day my uncle died, his lawyer handed me a key and told me something that made absolutely no sense. He said, "Your uncle left you one instruction." I looked at the old brass key in his hand and asked him, "What instruction?" He lowered his voice and said, "Whatever you do, never open locker 17. He had no children, no wife, and apparently no one else he trusted enough to inherit his belongings, so most of his estate was going to be divided between a few relatives. But the lawyer told me there was one private storage locker, specifically mentioned in my uncle's handwritten instructions. I asked why he would leave it to me, and the lawyer simply said, he didn't explain. He only said you would understand when the time came. Then, he gave me the address. Locker 17 was at the very end of a long concrete corridor where the lights flickered every few seconds and the air smelled like dust and old cardboard. The lock was old, and the metal door was covered in scratches. Written across it in faded black paint were 3 words, "Do not open." I stood there for almost a minute, wondering whether my uncle had left the warning because there was something dangerous inside, or because he knew curiosity would eventually win. Naturally, my curiosity won, and I opened it. Inside weren't stacks of cash, jewelry, or anything else I had imagined. There were 6 cardboard boxes, an old television, several filing cabinets, and a wooden chair facing the back wall. The room looked almost empty until I noticed the photographs. There were hundreds of them, arranged in piles across the floor and inside the cabinets, and every photograph showed the same man. The man in every photograph was my father. I hadn't seen my father in 15 years. When I was 12, he supposedly walked away from my mother and me without saying goodbye. That was the story I had grown up with, and for years I had been angry enough to believe it without question. But the first photograph I picked up showed my father standing beside my uncle outside a bank, and the date written on the back was 20 years earlier. I turned it over twice, as if the date might change. I turned it over twice, but the date didn't change. My father had supposedly disappeared before that photograph was taken, which meant someone had been lying to me for a very long time. Part 2. The photographs of my father. I kept searching through the boxes, and the more I found, the less I understood. There were photographs of my father outside banks, entering courthouses, sitting in restaurants with businessmen, and meeting people whose names appeared again and again in documents stored inside the cabinets. Then I saw Victor Hale standing in several of the photographs. I recognized him immediately, because his face had been on television for years. He was a wealthy businessman who had built a reputation for buying struggling companies and turning them around. But 15 years earlier, he had acquired my mother's small manufacturing company and dismantled it piece by piece. My mother lost nearly everything, and she had always blamed Victor for what happened to our family. I had spent years hating him because I believed he was the man who had taken away our security. Now I was looking at photographs of Victor meeting my father. I found a folder with my name written across it, and inside were copies of my birth certificate, school records, medical records, and photographs from different periods of my childhood. There was also a handwritten letter from my uncle. It began, "If you're reading this, you're finally old enough to know what your father actually did." The letter explained that my father hadn't simply abandoned us. He had disappeared after discovering that Victor was secretly buying failing businesses through shell companies, moving money between them, and stripping their assets before selling whatever remained. My father's company had accidentally uncovered part of the operation, and after that he had been followed and threatened. My uncle believed my father went into hiding because he thought someone was going to kill him. The letter made one thing clear. My uncle had spent 15 years collecting evidence, but it didn't explain why he had kept it inside locker 17. I searched deeper and found contracts, bank statements, handwritten notes, and several old audio recordings. Almost everything pointed toward Victor, until I found a photograph that made me stop breathing. Victor was shaking hands with my mother. I stared at it for a long time, because my mother had always told me she hated that man. I found another photograph of them together, then another. The meetings weren't random because they had taken place over several years. I called my mother immediately, but she didn't answer. I called again, and still nothing. Then my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered, and a man's voice said, "You opened locker 17. I didn't speak, and he continued, "Your uncle told you not to." I asked who he was, and after a brief pause he replied, "Someone who knows what happened to your father." Then the call ended. Part 3. The recording. At the bottom of the final box, I found an old cassette recorder with a handwritten note taped to it. It said, "Play this alone." Static filled the room before a voice came through the speaker. I knew the voice immediately, because it was my father's voice. He said, "Daniel, if you're hearing this, your uncle finally decided to tell you. I spent years investigating the people responsible for what happened to our family, but I didn't disappear because of Victor Hale. I disappeared because I discovered the truth." He explained that Victor wasn't simply stealing businesses. The companies were being used to move money and hide ownership of properties and accounts, and my father had discovered that the operation reached far beyond Victor himself. Then he said something that made me stop the recording. "Daniel, your mother knows." I drove straight to my mother's house. When she opened the door and saw my face, she immediately understood why I was there. I held up the photograph of her and Victor and asked, "How long have you been meeting him?" She looked at the photograph, then at me, and whispered, "Your uncle shouldn't have given you that key." I asked where my father was, and she didn't answer. I asked again, and finally she admitted something I had spent 15 years believing was impossible. My father was still alive after all those years. I asked where he was, but instead of answering, my mother sat down and began crying. Then she told me something that made the entire story even more confusing. She said my father wasn't hiding from Victor. She said he had been hiding from us all along. When I asked what that meant, she looked directly at me and said, "Your father was the one who started it." I couldn't believe her. She claimed my father had created the first shell companies, recruited Victor, and built the operation before things became too large for him to control. I asked why my uncle would leave me evidence against Victor if my father was responsible, and she said my uncle had discovered what my father had done and had eventually helped him cover it up. I asked whether my father had killed my uncle, but she immediately shook her head. She immediately shook her head and said, "No, your uncle helped him. Your uncle helped him because he believed there was no other way to protect you." Before I left, my mother gave me an address in a small coastal town and told me that my father had been living there under another name. She also warned me that he had been watching me from a distance for years. I didn't know whether I was walking into the truth or another lie, but I drove through the night anyway. Part 4. I found my father. By sunrise, I was standing outside a quiet house near the coast. I knocked once, then again, and an older man finally opened the door. He had gray hair, a thin face, and tired eyes, but I recognized him immediately. The man in every photograph was my father. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me and said, "You look like your mother." I wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but the only thing I could say was, "Why?" He looked down and answered, "Because I was afraid you'd become like me." Then he stepped aside and told me to come in. The house was filled with filing cabinets, just like Locker 17. He opened one and showed me records containing evidence against Victor, but there were also files documenting my father's own actions. I stared at him and asked, "You kept records on yourself?" He nodded and said, "I knew one day someone would come looking, and I knew that if they found only the evidence against Victor, they would never understand what really happened." I asked why he had let me believe he abandoned us. He explained that Victor had been watching my mother, and after my father disappeared, people connected to Victor continued monitoring the family. If anyone discovered that my father was still alive, they could have used me to find him. My father believed that making me hate him was safer than letting me know he was protecting me. Then he handed me a folder containing a bank transfer from Victor Hale to an account connected to my mother. The date was the exact date my father disappeared. I looked at him and asked, "She took his money?" He shook his head and said, "No, that payment wasn't to silence her. It was to protect you." I looked at the document again and noticed that the receiving account wasn't my mother's. The account receiving the money was mine. A trust account had been created in my name, and money had been deposited into it for years. I asked what it was for, and my father smiled sadly. "Your revenge." I didn't understand, so he opened another file. Inside were hundreds of documents proving Victor's operation, but there was something even more important. Copies of those documents had already been sent to federal investigators, sealed and scheduled to be released if anything happened to my father. He had spent 15 years building a case. He hadn't been waiting for an opportunity to hurt Victor. He had been waiting for the right opportunity to make sure Victor could never escape. Part 5. The Money in the Trap. He told me that every time he considered coming back, someone connected to Victor appeared near our family. He had learned to recognize surveillance vehicles, unfamiliar people, and even small changes in the routine around my mother's house. He believed Victor's network was still watching, and he was afraid that one emotional mistake would put me in danger. Then my father looked toward the window and said, "There's one problem. Victor knows you're here." I turned toward the glass and saw a black SUV parked across the street. It looked ordinary, but it had been sitting there long enough for the engine to cool, and there was a man inside watching the house. My father didn't panic when he saw the vehicle outside. Instead, he walked to a desk, opened a drawer, and handed me a phone. "Call the number your uncle left you." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because that's why your uncle gave you the key." That was when I finally understood that Locker 17 hadn't been an inheritance. The storage locker had been a trap from the beginning. My uncle knew that Victor would eventually discover the storage locker. He also knew that Victor would assume my father's son was simply an innocent person who had accidentally found old evidence. That made me the perfect person to carry the evidence without attracting suspicion. The photographs weren't meant to stay hidden forever. They were designed to make Victor believe someone had recovered the past, and the moment Victor reacted, the people watching him would know exactly where to look. I called the number my uncle had left me. The phone rang once. Then Victor Hale answered. He didn't sound angry at all, and instead he sounded almost amused by the situation. "You should have left the past alone." I looked at my father, then at the black SUV outside, and finally at the mountain of evidence surrounding me. I asked Victor, "How long have you known about Locker 17? He laughed softly and said, "Long enough to know that your uncle was afraid of me." I asked, "Did you kill him?" There was a pause. Then Victor said, "Your uncle knew what would happen if he kept digging." That wasn't an admission, but it was enough for me to understand that he knew far more than he should have. Victor then said, "You have no idea what your father did." I looked at my father and replied, "Maybe not, but I know what you did." Victor's voice became colder. "You should have left the past alone." I smiled and said, "You should have learned something about my family." He went silent. "We don't forget." I ended the call, and my father simply nodded. He knew the next part of the plan had already begun. Part 6. The people behind Victor. My father had already provided them with the location and the evidence, and the phone call had given them something they needed even more, proof that Victor was aware of the investigation and was attempting to interfere with it. The black SUV tried to leave, but agents stopped it before it reached the end of the street. Victor wasn't inside the SUV when investigators stopped it. That was the first sign that something had gone wrong. The man in the SUV was one of Victor's private security contractors, and inside his vehicle, investigators found another phone, several photographs of my house, and a list of names. One of those names belonged to me. Another name belonged to my mother. A third belonged to my father. But the list didn't end there. There were names of bankers, lawyers, business owners, former employees, and people connected to companies Victor had acquired over the years. Investigators began tracing the names and discovered that the operation was much larger than anyone had expected. Victor had used failing companies to move money, but he had also used them to acquire properties through people who didn't know who ultimately controlled them. My father had spent years documenting the operation because he knew that a single accusation wouldn't be enough. He needed records, transfers, contracts, photographs, and witnesses. Locker 17 contained the history, while the files in my father's house contained the connections between the history and the people still operating the network. The next morning, Victor was arrested at a private airport while attempting to leave the country. When investigators questioned him, he denied everything, but then they showed him the photographs from Locker 17. His expression changed the moment he recognized the photographs. He asked one question that immediately revealed how much he knew. "Where did you get those?" The investigator replied, "Your biggest mistake was believing they had disappeared." That afternoon, my mother arrived at the federal office and gave investigators the information she had hidden for 15 years. She explained that Victor had once threatened to expose my father's involvement in the original shell companies unless she cooperated. She had accepted the payments because my father told her the money would create a protected future for me. But she had never known whether he would actually return. For years, everyone in the family had been lying for what they believed was protection, and Victor had built his power around the assumption that those lies would never be uncovered. But now they were all connected to the same evidence. Part 7. Locker 17 was the beginning. The investigation continued for months, and the deeper investigators went, the more people they found connected to Victor's network. Several businesses had been deliberately destroyed so their assets could be purchased cheaply. Property records had been altered through intermediaries, money had been transferred through layers of companies, and people who tried to question the transactions had suddenly found themselves facing lawsuits, financial pressure, or threats. My uncle had spent years documenting those patterns without knowing whether anyone would ever believe him. My father had spent even longer collecting evidence against himself and the people around him, and I finally understood why my uncle had left me locker 17 instead of simply giving the evidence to the police. He didn't trust one institution to protect everything. He wanted someone from the family to see the entire story first, because he believed that once I understood what had happened, I would have a reason to make sure it couldn't disappear again. Victor eventually faced charges connected to the financial operation, intimidation, and obstruction. The people who had helped him began turning on each other, and every new witness produced another piece of the puzzle. The empire Victor had built over 15 years began collapsing because the evidence wasn't based on one person's accusation. It was built from thousands of small records that all pointed in the same direction. My father testified before the investigators and explained what he had discovered. My mother testified as well, and finally explained what she had hidden. Eventually, I testified too, and told them everything I had learned. During one of the final hearings, Victor looked across the room at me and said, "You think you've won?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I looked at him and said, "No, I don't think I've won anything yet. I think you finally ran out of places to hide." He stared at me for several seconds before looking away. That was the closest thing to an apology I ever received. I had spent years believing that if I ever got the chance to confront Victor, I would want him to feel the same anger I had carried since childhood. Instead, I felt tired after carrying that anger for so many years, because the truth was finally bigger than my anger. The man I had hated for 15 years had become only one part of a story that included my father, my mother, my uncle, and an entire network of people who had convinced themselves that secrets were more powerful than consequences. Part 8, The Last Key. After 15 years of believing my father had abandoned me, I finally understood what had actually happened. He had made terrible choices. He had lied, and he had disappeared, but he had never stopped protecting me. My mother admitted that she had kept the truth from me because she believed it was the only way to keep me alive, and my uncle had spent the final years of his life making sure the evidence would eventually reach me. Victor was eventually convicted after the investigation uncovered the full operation, and the people who had helped him were forced to answer for their own actions. Several businesses were returned to their rightful owners, financial records were recovered, and families who had spent years believing they had simply suffered bad luck finally discovered why their lives had been destroyed. Locker 17 was emptied, photographed, and sealed as evidence. When the storage facility finally returned the brass lock to me, I stood outside Locker 17 for a long time thinking about the warning my uncle had left on the door. The words were simple and unmistakable. "Do not open." It had sounded like a warning. In the end, it was an invitation. I kept the old brass key, not because it was valuable, but because it reminded me that my uncle had understood something before anyone else did. Sometimes the truth has to remain hidden long enough for the right person to find it, and sometimes revenge isn't about destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's about letting them believe they've won while quietly collecting every piece of evidence they need to destroy themselves. There were questions I still couldn't forgive him for avoiding, and there were things he would never be able to explain away. But for the first time in my life, I could ask him those questions without wondering whether he was going to disappear again. As for me, I never looked at an old key the same way. Because that key didn't unlock a room full of money. It unlocked the truth about my family, exposed a man who thought he was untouchable, and gave me back 15 years of my life that I thought had been built on a lie. Sometimes revenge isn't about making someone suffer. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply making sure the truth survives. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can leave behind is the truth that no one can bury forever.